Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to New Worlds November. This is an event that was created by Scott and Becky at the Bookish Bryans, and we have a whole roster of great co-hosts for New Worlds November, which is designed to celebrate science fiction in the month of November. We'd hope that it would catch on, that it would be a nice big BookTube event that celebrates science fiction. And in order to help narrow the field of science fiction, we use two different things for this November. The first is for this year's New Worlds November to concentrate on short stories. Anything shorter than 200 pages is good enough. And the second thing was to have prompts, to have sort of narrowing category challenges for each week of November. And the first of those, which we're running out the clock on here, is aliens. So science fiction short stories featuring aliens in some way or other. And I decided right at the beginning, right when I learned about New Worlds November, I decided that what I would do. I decided that I would concentrate on the square-bound pulp periodicals that publish science fiction short stories still to this day. Asimov's, Analog, and the Mystery of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Those are the three big ones in the United States market. And you get a lot. They each come out bi-monthly, and you get a lot of contents in every one of them. Tons of book reviews, lots and lots of fact articles, and lots of short stories of all kinds of varying lengths. They make a point of varying that. So you will get, in any issue of any one of those three, you'll get 2-page stories, 10-page stories, and some novellas, some things that go on for quite some time. I made a point of sort of a challenge to myself that I would go through those issues for 2021, starting with January, February, and just moving forward in all three of those issues. I reckoned without the fact that November is just so long. November doesn't go on forever. So I'm barely going to get out of that first batch of issues, right? I'm dealing with 3 issues, all 3 of which came out for the January-February market. I'm barely going to get through that batch, just that first one, just looking at alien stories before we move on to the next prompt. And I was going to go do this all throughout the year and then go back to the beginning for each new prompt. But unless I make 10 videos a day, I'm not going to be able to do that. So instead, what I will do is, whatever the next prompt is, I will look at the next 3 issues, the next Asimov, the next Analog, and the next Fantasy and Science Fiction. I will look at the next 3 issues for that prompt rather than look. I'm sure that I forget which prompt is coming up next, but I'm sure that I've read and reread stories from this first batch of issues that fit that second prompt. Instead, I've just gone through these issues for stories about aliens, and I haven't talked about all of them. There have been quite a few. I haven't talked about all of them. Instead, I'm using the ones that I do talk about to illustrate or discuss certain points, certain kinds of things that you can look at in a short story or that you can look for in a short story. The first thing that I mentioned, one of those things, was the interesting thing to look at in science fiction of any kind, but also in fiction of any kind, is how it echoes the environment in which the author is writing. And how explicit that is. Is the author explicitly echoing the time in order to make a strand of relevance throughout the story because they think relevance will help sell the story, or maybe their story didn't have that element and they were told by an editor, put that element in there and we'll take it, leave it out and we won't. It's always interesting to look at that element in short stories, I think, and we've looked at a bunch of other things too. Today's short story comes from the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And this magazine, it's square-bound. It's actually thicker than Asimov's or Analog, or at least it appears so because it's a little bit shorter. Smaller in dimensions, so it could be that it has the same relative page count. And as you can tell from the title, this isn't all science fiction. There are book reviews, very good book reviews in this magazine. They have the best book reviewing team of the 3. And there are the occasional nonfiction pieces, but this magazine's table of contents splits between fantasy stories and science fiction stories. Obviously, for fantasy stories, I'm leaving them completely alone. Even if they have aliens in them, I'm still leaving them completely alone. Oh, I hear what you're saying. Perhaps there needs to be a fantasy event that's the equivalent of New Worlds November. Think that might be a good idea? I do too. Instead, in this issue, I went through for the alien stories, and there are this is a weak issue. It's a weak issue for both fantasy and science fiction. There are quite a few very short 2 or 3 page stories in here that really should not have made the cut. They shouldn't have been in here. Now, I have nothing but sympathy for the editors of this thing. I've been in that position. You're up against the wall. You've got a table of contents to fill. You can't always be all that picky. And you can always console yourself by saying, well, I wasn't desperate. I was just trying to provide variety. I know that wheeze very well. But I did find a story in here that I remember reading. I reread it, really liked it, and it illustrates a kind of science fiction short story that we haven't seen yet, which is historical. So not the author of the story working in elements of the present day. Not that. So not a science fiction short story in which a weird autocratic alien with strangely orange skin starts to take over a previously free country. Heavy-handed metaphor like that. Not a story like that, but rather, can you find science fiction in the past? And this author finds it in the most unlikely place, and it works so well. I marked the place here. The author is John Kessel. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I know that name. Maybe I do. I probably don't know him as well as Mark or Sean would. But the story is called The Dark Ride by John Kessel. And it takes place at the 1901 Pan American Exhibition in New York. It takes place when this was the 1901 Pan American Exposition was one of these big expositions. I don't think really happen anymore. I mean, or they're so explicitly commercial, like Apple's Reveal Day, that they're nauseating. But once upon a time, that was where you went to get, the temple of the future, or here's an innovation that may happen in our lifetime, or here's the latest that astronomy is revealing about the cosmos, about the heavens, as it was called then. It was usually no expense was spared for the physical setup. A lot of you will know this for the Victorian era. That was a very famous exhibition in the Victorian era that Prince Albert was all involved in organizing. Usually no expense was spared in the physical trappings. So it was a great day, is what I'm trying to say. It was a great day out anyway, even if you weren't all caught up in the futurism of the event. And in 1901, the U.S. President, McKinley, went to this exhibit and was walking around with some of his cronies and some of his friends. He was greeting people all the time. He was a big, sort of forbidding man. If you just looked at him, you'd think he was certainly going to strangle you, but he had a very, very warm streak to him. Loved to greet people. Loved to greet children, little babies. He didn't always have a congenial word for you. That was his successor. But he did like to meet people. It wasn't fake. And he was there at that exhibit when he was shot by a man named Leon Czolgosz. Had the stereotypical handkerchief around the gun, waited until McKinley was right on top of him, and then shot him. And McKinley didn't die. He didn't even go unconscious right away. He staggered back. The crowd went nuts on Czolgosz. They would have killed him right on the spot if it weren't for McKinley. McKinley told his own men, some of whom McKinley and Roosevelt were just at the beginning of there being a formal Secret Service. Just at the beginning of that, where it isn't just that you're getting a colonel, a dress colonel, as kind of a hint at military pomp, but rather that you have a couple of guys with blackjacks and guns who are there to make sure no one gets at you. That was just at its beginning. That's the only way that an idiot like Czolgosz would have been allowed anywhere near the President of the United States. And McKinley lived for a while. Czolgosz was beaten rather badly at the scene, but he wasn't killed because McKinley told people to leave him alone. So he was taken into custody. He gave a fake name. He held his breath for a long time. The whole country did. The whole world did. But especially the country. The country wanted McKinley to live. And it looked for a while like he might, but he didn't. There wasn't any kind of trauma follow-up. There was no way to save him. Past a certain point, there was no way to save him. It's just nobody at the time knew that. And no one expected it. Bulletins and even McKinley kept thinking that he was getting stronger. He wasn't. He was badly infected. There was no way that he was going to live. But everybody was fooled, which is why, when McKinley finally did die, his vice president was 10 states away at the top of a mountain. There was no advance warning. And of course, the person who worried the most about what was going to happen to McKinley was Leon Czolgosz, the man who shot him, because that would determine a lot. That would change a lot. And when this story is set in the Pan American Exhibition, and it's the narrative focal point is Czolgosz, nervously, sweatily getting a gun, nervously planning to go to the exhibition, nervously wondering where the president will be and how this will actually go, and talking to his furtive colleagues who don't know what he's planning or who don't believe that he'll do it. And I thought, well, okay, that's great for historical fiction. McKinley is badly underserved for historical fiction, but that's not science fiction. It can't be science fiction. But in John Kessel's story, one of the exhibits at the Pan American exhibit is about the moon, which is inhabited by aliens. Selenites, from Selene, the goddess of the moon. Selenites inhabit the moon. This was before anybody knew what the moon was really like. This was long before there was any kind of probe of the moon. It was huge. It looked like it might be another world where beings could live. People had thought that since the ancient times. I've never understood that. Really. Because long before I read any science fiction, long before I read any science, long before I knew anything at all, when I was just a wee ting, I knew perfectly well the moon is not inhabited. You can look up in the sky. Maybe it's just that most science, or most of the speculation, is done by people who live in cities where there's lots of light pollution. But if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you look at the moon, you can tell that it's a rock. It's a rock. There's nothing there that's living. But people have always thought that, and that the exhibit in John Kessel's story is all about the fabulous civilization of the Selenites and how they are afflicted, and there is political unrest, and the story proceeds from there with Czolgosz getting to know the Selenites and getting to understand their own political factionism, and how it quasi-mirrors his own extremist political views that sent him there to kill the president in the first place. And it's wonderful the way John Kessel does it, because you're never 100% sure that the whole of Czolgosz's adventures with the Selenites isn't just his own fevered imagination. You're never sure that it's real. And that's another way that you can have aliens in science fiction short stories, is to have them where you're never really sure they exist at all. I think that's fantastic. I was happy to reread this story and remember what a treat it was. If I remember correctly, actually, let's take a look at the table of contents. If I remember correctly, this was easily the best thing in this issue. And this issue includes a story by Robert Reed that is about the end of the world. It's about a rapidly descending end of the world, violent end of the world, that I didn't think worked. I didn't think it worked well at all. There's lots and lots of books. There's a piece on film. There's a piece on science. But what about the stories? Integral Nothings by Robert Reed. The Diamond Family Glitters by H. Puyo. Little Knife Music by Jen Reese. Enraptured by Justin Key. No, I'm right. I am remembering this correctly. The Dark Ride by John Kessel is by far the best thing in this issue. And I'm pretty sure that's going to wrap up our first week of New Worlds November. I don't think, if I can find another alien story for roughly this time period, I'll do it tomorrow. But otherwise, I'll just start on Monday with the new prompt. And I'm one of the hosts, so you'd think I know what that prompt is. The prompts, just in general, are aliens, AI or robots, dystopian or post-apocalyptic, and time travel. I just don't remember what order they take place in, so it'll be one of those for next week. I'll have to figure that out. But this ends on a strong note. This was a very interesting story. The classic great payoff of anthologies of any kind, in addition to finding a great story, which you're always going to do. In every issue of these three magazines, you're always going to find one story, at least, that's just terrific, that you just smile to have read. But in addition to all that, as I mentioned, anthologies can also tip you off to an author you might like to pursue. And I would like to find out, do I know John Kessel? Have I read books of his? Maybe have I skipped a short story of his in a previous anthology that maybe now I want to go back and read, see if it's as good as this one. But that's your alien prompt for today is the kind of alien that happens often in historical science fiction, but it can happen in present day science fiction too. I'm thinking of one particular story. I don't remember the author. I've read many science fiction stories where the author leaves open the possibility that the aliens aren't there at all. That this is just a fever of the imagination. Very, very enjoyable. So I'm gonna wrap this video up for now. I'd love to hear from you if you're doing New Worlds November. I'd love to hear if you're reading anything good. If you're enjoying what you're reading, that would be great. Do you plan on switching prompts when we figure out what the next one is? And what do you plan on doing for that? Love to hear about it. Feel free to tell me either in the comments field or you can email me. But I'm going to wrap this up. I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.